Detective Ellis Monroe had long ago grown numb to the gruesome details that came with his work. But this time, he felt something different. A visceral unease as he stared at the case file laid open on his desk. It was a collection of yellowed photos and newspaper clippings from 1986, an era infamously plagued by the so-called Satanic Panic. Yet these files weren't just about misplaced fears or mass hysteria. They held reports of a series of murders, supposedly ritualistic, from a rural town that had since faded from memory. As Ellis flipped through the old photographs, he tried to process the bizarre, gory images. Photos of makeshift altars drenched in blood, mutilated bodies, and symbols carved into trees. The victims' eyes had been gouged out, their lips sewn shut. Detective Monroe, his supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Vargas, stood in his doorway, her arms crossed. "I'm not sure you should be looking into that case." Ellis looked up, frowning. "Why's that?" She sighed. "Because everyone who's ever tried to investigate these cases, well, they either quit or disappeared." Disappeared? Ellis's voice was skeptical, but his fingers continued to grip the edges of the old file. "Listen," Vargas continued, lowering her voice. "These aren't just stories about crazed lunatics. There were rumors of something larger, a cult, or even an organized sect. They hid behind the Satanic Panic of the 80s, used it as cover, and we have every reason to believe they're still active." Ellis felt a chill crawl up his spine. He flipped the file shut. "Permission to dig deeper?" Vargas paused, giving him a knowing look before she nodded. "Be careful." The journey took Ellis to Fairgrove, a small town that hadn't seemed to age since the 1980s. There, he found one of the retired officers who had been on the case decades earlier. Detective Sam Thatcher was frail, his hands trembling as he poured himself a whiskey at the dingy bar where they met. "Why'd you want to meet here?" Ellis asked, eyeing the locals, who seemed to avoid Thatcher's gaze with silent reverence. Thatcher sipped his drink before finally looking up. "This is the only place where they can't hear us." "They," Ellis pressed. "The cult." Thatcher's voice was barely a whisper. "They're still out there, Detective. We were never supposed to dig too deep. Those murders, they were ritual sacrifices, a pact, and anyone who got too close." Thatcher trailed off, his eyes unfocused, like he was reliving something too horrible to say out loud. Ellis leaned forward. "Tell me what happened." The old man shook his head, then laughed bitterly. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." Thatcher's hands clenched around his glass. "The bodies we found, they weren't just murdered, they were butchered. Some were found with their skin peeled back, others had their hearts ripped out. And then there were the symbols, carved into every tree, drawn in blood around the bodies." "What kind of symbols?" Ellis's voice was low, as if speaking any louder would disturb the ghosts that lingered in the room. Thatcher's eyes glazed over as he muttered, "They called them the marks of the fallen. They said they were offerings for something beyond our world." Ellis felt no closer to answers as he left Thatcher, his mind a haze of horrific images. He decided to follow up on a lead about a reclusive figure known in town as the Keeper, an elderly man who had been rumored to be present at the last known site of a ritual. The Keeper's cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, and Ellis had to hike for nearly an hour to reach it. The air grew thick as he approached, a heaviness pressing down on him. The Keeper sat on his porch, his gaze sharp despite his age. "Detective," he greeted, as if he'd been expecting him. "I know why you're here." Ellis nodded cautiously. "You were there, weren't you? During the rituals." The Keeper looked off into the trees. "The things I've seen would freeze your blood, son. They carved people up, one by one in those woods. Tore them apart like animals. The cult calls it the feeding, and they say the blood opens a gateway to the underworld." "Why did they stop?" Ellis asked, his stomach twisting at the thought. The Keeper turned his gaze back to him, unblinking. "They never stopped. They just got smarter. Now they choose their victims carefully, avoid the media. But they're still here, still feeding, and they've been waiting for someone like you." Ellis froze, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" The Keeper's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're the perfect sacrifice, Detective. They love a martyr, and they've been watching you, following you. Once you started digging, you were already marked." Ellis could feel the weight of the forest closing in around him. The air was thick, damp with an unsettling silence that only deepened as he made his way toward the flickering glow ahead. He forced himself to keep moving, each step sinking into the soft, damp earth as he followed the faint chanting that grew louder with every step. When he reached the clearing, he froze, his heart hammering. A circle of hooded figures surrounded a stone altar, their hands lifted to the sky in reverence. Symbols and words written in an ancient, sinister script covered their robes, symbols Ellis recognized from the files he had studied obsessively. Inverted pentagrams, horns, serpents, and the name Lucifer etched over and over in dark crimson ink. The cultists chanted in a language Ellis couldn't understand, their words guttural and feverish, echoing through the trees. The words felt like they were reaching into his mind, warping his thoughts and stirring some primal part of him that recoiled in horror. A voice rang out from the center of the circle, louder than the others. It belonged to a figure dressed in a robe darker than night, his face hidden beneath the hood. "Brothers and sisters," he intoned, his voice dripping with authority and malice. "Tonight, we offer blood in the name of our true Lord, the bringer of light, Lucifer." The cultists murmured in agreement, bowing their heads as the leader continued. "We are the chosen few, the ones who understand the truth of Satan's promise. We reject the hollow lies of light and salvation. We seek knowledge, power, and eternal life, gifts that only the morning star, the fallen Lucifer, can grant us." Ellis's skin crawled as he watched them, horrified yet transfixed. They didn't see themselves as killers or madmen. They saw themselves as enlightened seekers, followers of some twisted gospel of darkness. The leader gestured to a figure tied to the altar, a young man barely conscious, his chest heaving in ragged gasps. His body was marked with fresh cuts and bruises, symbols carved into his flesh that mirrored those on the cultists' robes. His mouth was sewn shut, his eyes wild with terror as he thrashed against his restraints. One of the cultists stepped forward, a blade gleaming in his hand. "With this sacrifice we open the gateway to the infernal realm," he declared, his voice trembling with fervor. "We summon our Lord Satan, the great adversary, to bring his power into this world." Ellis's stomach turned as he watched the blade descend, carving a deep line across the man's chest. Blood poured from the wound, pooling on the stone and dripping onto the ground where the earth seemed to drink it in, almost hungrily. The leader raised his hands, his eyes alight with an unnatural fervor. "Lucifer, devil, fallen one, hear us, accept this sacrifice, and let your presence flood this world once more," the cultists chanted, their voices growing louder, almost ecstatic. Ellis could feel something dark, something ancient, stirring around him, as if the very air had come alive with malice. He felt a presence, a cold, oppressive weight that pressed down on him, wrapping around his chest, making it hard to breathe. The leader stepped forward, drawing symbols in the blood with his fingers, symbols Ellis recognized from occult texts, ancient seals associated with demonic rites, symbols that were said to invite Satan himself into the mortal realm. "We are yours, O Prince of Darkness," he whispered, his voice barely audible but laced with reverence. "We live to serve you, to carry your will. Give us the strength to bring this world to its knees. Show us the power of damnation." The air grew colder, and the ground beneath Ellis seemed to tremble. Shadows stretched and twisted, forming shapes that shouldn't exist, shapes that seemed almost alive. He could feel the pull, the sickening allure of the cult's faith. It was a darkness so complete, so ancient, that it threatened to consume him whole. As the chanting reached a fevered pitch, the cult leader turned his gaze toward Ellis, his eyes burning with an unholy fire. "Welcome, detective," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "We've been waiting for you." Before Ellis could react, the cultists surrounded him, their hands reaching out, gripping his arms, his shoulders, dragging him toward the altar. He struggled, but their grip was iron, and the presence, the dark force that seemed to watch him from the shadows, was overwhelming. "Tonight," the leader whispered, leaning close, "we offer you as a gift to Lucifer. You will become his voice, his vessel, his servant in this world. You came looking for us, detective, but you found far more than you ever wanted." Ellis's vision blurred as they forced him onto the blood-soaked altar, binding him with ropes that cut into his flesh. He could feel the warmth of the blood beneath him, the smell of copper and decay filling his nostrils. The cultists began a new chant, their voices low and rhythmic, each word seeping into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. He felt his will slipping, his mind fraying as the darkness seeped in, filling every corner of his being. "Accept him, O devil," the leader intoned, raising his hand. "Let him be your servant, your harbinger, your voice among men. Through him we shall know your wrath, your vengeance, your unending thirst for power." As the knife descended, Ellis felt a burning pain, a pain that was more than physical, a tearing sensation deep within him, as if something were ripping his soul from his body. He screamed, but his voice was lost in the chanting, swallowed by the darkness that surrounded him. And in that moment he felt it, a presence, cold and ancient, sliding into his mind, filling the empty spaces, taking control. He was no longer himself. He was something more, something darker. The last thing he saw before his vision went dark was the cultists bowing before him, their faces alight with reverence and fear, their voices chanting a single name, Lucifer. And as the darkness claimed him, he understood. He was no longer Ellis Monroe. He was something far older, far more dangerous, a vessel of the devil, a harbinger of Lucifer's will on earth. And he was ready to carry out their twisted gospel of terror. Days later, the townspeople found the clearing in the woods, but there was no sign of Ellis Monroe. All they found were traces of blood, a stone slab stained dark, and symbols carved into the trees. The cult was gone, vanished into the night, leaving only the memory of their dark rites and the unsettling sense that they would one day return. Ellis was never seen again. But those who ventured too close to the woods claimed to hear whispers, faint but unmistakable, of a desperate man trapped between worlds, his voice mingling with the ancient chants that echoed from the shadows. Years passed, and the story of Detective Ellis Monroe faded into local legend. The woods around Fairgrove grew over with brambles and vines, swallowing whatever traces remained of that dark night. But the locals still spoke of him in hushed voices, warning one another to avoid the forest, especially after dark. One night, long after anyone in town remembered Ellis's face, a group of teenagers dared each other to venture into the forest. They set out after midnight, their flashlights trembling as they whispered about the legends of the occult and Ellis's disappearance. As they walked deeper into the forest, they began to feel a growing chill, as if the air itself were thick with dread. The forest seemed to close in around them, shadows moving unnaturally, and whispers echoed in the distance, almost as if the trees themselves were speaking. But the whispers grew louder, taking on a familiar voice one of the teens, a girl named Hannah, recognized from years of hearing her grandfather talk about him. The voice called her name. "Hannah," it rasped, "you have to help me." The group froze, and Hannah stepped forward, drawn toward the sound. There, barely illuminated by her flashlight, was a figure lying on the ground, his face obscured by dirt and blood but unmistakable. It was Detective Ellis Monroe, alive but barely. "Ellis?" she whispered, fear and confusion twisting her voice. He reached out with a trembling hand. "They didn't let me die," he whispered, his voice cracked and hollow. "They kept me here, trapped, feeding off me." "What do you mean?" Hannah asked, horror dawning in her eyes as she watched his broken figure, covered in strange scars and symbols that pulsed faintly under his skin. "They took my soul but left my body as a conduit. Every time someone dies in these woods, I'm forced to relive that night. Every sacrifice, every drop of blood, it all feeds through me." He coughed and blood trickled from his mouth, but his grip tightened on her arm, desperate. "I need you to end this, Hannah. Burn the woods, destroy everything, before they use me to bring something worse." Suddenly, a chilling laugh echoed around them, as if the forest itself were mocking them. Shadows crept closer, morphing into figures with pale, empty faces. The cult had returned. They watched in silence, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Hannah pulled away, her heart racing. "Ellis, we have to get you out of here." But Ellis shook his head. "I'm already dead, Hannah. You have to destroy my body. It's the only way to break the curse. If you don't, they'll use me. They'll use me to bring their God into this world." Just as she nodded, steeling herself for what had to be done, Ellis's expression changed. His face contorted, his eyes darkening. He laughed, a low, malevolent sound that didn't belong to him. "Oh, but it's too late," he sneered, his voice now layered with a darker, unnatural tone. "They've already succeeded. I am their God, and I've been here all along, waiting to be released." As the cult members moved forward, surrounding them, Ellis's eyes turned entirely black, and his mouth twisted into a smile filled with ancient malice. In that instant, Hannah realized the horrifying truth. Ellis was no longer himself. He had become the vessel for something far older, far darker, something that had been waiting patiently in the shadows, bound only by the ritual that had once taken him. The cultists chanted, their voices rising as the forest seemed to come alive, the trees bending, the earth rumbling. As the ground split open beneath her feet, Hannah's last thought before the darkness overtook her was that the stories had never told the full truth. The satanic panic had been more than hysteria. It had been a warning that the real horror had always been waiting beneath the surface, biding its time. And now, with Ellis's body as its bridge, it was free. As the ground closed around Hannah, muffling her screams, the figure of Ellis Monroe stood alone in the clearing, staring out with hollow, blackened eyes. A cold, dark smile spread across his face as he took his first steps out of the forest and into the unsuspecting world. The evil that had waited so long in the shadows was finally free to walk among men, wearing the face of a dead man, ready to begin its work anew.